everyone, Yoel here again for HebrewInIsrael.net, and we finally come to it. This is the dreaded polygamy video. I've actually made this video several times, and I've been very hesitant to even use any of those videos and even make this video. However, because we are interested in understanding Torah, and because I have seen multiple discussions online about this subject, I'm just going to toss in my opinion about this. You can agree or disagree with me, just don't be offensive. I've had too many cases of people that actually came out and verbally attacked me or said certain things. And with all due respect, if you're not going to make a point and you're just going to play around with things without really proving anything, then just do me a favor, don't even go there. It's very easy to block and ignore and so on. However, if people have a reasonable argument about this, then perfectly fine. So I'm actually going to touch on the subject of polygamy together with the subject of adultery, because they kind of go hand in hand, especially with the way Westerners understand the subject. So here's the thing. In essence, and I actually sat down to read multiple articles about this by academics, people who don't really have any religious shortcomings and so on. I looked into this, and the conclusion I came to very clearly is that polygamy is not forbidden in the Torah. No matter how you look at it, no matter what games people play, to argue that the Torah forbids polygamy is to read into the text things which are not there. For example, people who say Adam and Eve was only Adam and Eve. Okay, so there was only Adam and Eve. But how does that prove something which is forbidden or allowed in Torah? Adam and Eve, for example, clearly didn't eat meat. So did they, was there anything there about kosher laws about what they can eat and cannot eat? I mean, again, the problem is that people take stories or take things out of the Tanakh and they want to read into them. The fact remains that we actually have several stories in the Tanakh about people who married more than one wife, for whatever reason it may be. We have a description that the king is not allowed to have too many wives, which means that the assumption is that you are allowed to have more than one wife. The fact that he's the king doesn't really put him in any special position that enables him to have more wives. I mean, it just, the king himself is presented in the Tanakh as almost like someone who's of the rest of the people. He's just elevated over others, but he still has to abide to all the laws. And here specifically, he's actually been told to be limited in the number of wives that he has, because it can be very, very dangerous. It can actually probably cause wars, and we see it, cause wars between the sons and so on. So the Torah limits him, but it seems to be very, very clear that there is no prohibition whatsoever anywhere in the Tanakh to marry more than one wife. This literally isn't. People go around arguing that, these people added to the Torah and those people added to the Torah, and then suddenly you look at it and it's very clear people are also adding to the Torah. People are adding to the Torah because out of their own culture or out of their own need or necessity or whatever it might be. But here's the thing. Though it's very clear that polygamy is not forbidden, it does not necessarily mean that people actually practiced it. And here's the problem. We have stories of people who practiced polygamy. They married more than one wife, polygamy or bigamy, whatever one you want to talk about. But we have to remember that the culture of this region never forbade it. It was actually something people would do. However, there is no clear evidence that people did this on a regular basis. This is really the problem, and this is what I keep on seeing when people quote different scholars, especially Christian scholars who obviously come from a background where polygamy and bigamy is considered to be something as a big no-no. This connects to Christian culture and overall, but we get to that later on. I've seen people say it seems to be that the norm was to practice monogamy, and something, I agree with this. But I think the way they're trying to present it is as if this is what everyone considered to be what you should do. I think that's a way of, it's a misconstruing of what actually was going on. I think it's very clear that people actually understood that you can marry more than one wife. It was just a question of should I, would I, could I? Literally. To be able to have more than one wife means that you have to be able to provide for her. You have to be there for her. You have to be able to take care of all of her needs and so on. And most people were not rich. I mean, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, most people didn't have any money. It made no sense to marry more than one wife. There were reasons people married more than one wife. Usually it was wealthy people who wanted to have more children because children was considered to be a great blessing. And the moment a wife either cannot have children, which was a very common reason for people to marry another wife, without kicking out the older wife, people who just wanted to have as many children as they could. They had this ideology, some of them, of having many children. Having children was considered to be a great blessing. It's a common theme in a lot of ancient Near Eastern texts. And sometimes people would just, you can't ignore the fact that some men are men. And some men were interested in having that woman, then that woman, but they wanted to do it in a legal manner. However, whatever the case may be of the reason they married another wife, it was something that had to be done under very specific rules, because marriage is a contract and marriage is a covenant. You can't marry one wife and then suddenly ignore her. For example, one of my Facebook friends, who happens to be a woman, wrote about this. She openly wrote about it, and I saw the back and forth. And most people said, listen, you have to realize it's about culture, and the culture is different, which is 100% true. But she made one very, very important point, which reminds me of the book of Malachi. She said, a wife can give birth to many children, take care of her husband, take care of the family for a very long time, and suddenly he brings in this younger woman, and he treats her as a queen. And that's unfair. And I know what's something, I agree with that. And that's what's actually what Malachi is talking about. He's not against marrying other women. He's against a practice that was going on where people were ignoring their first wife. They were ignoring the woman they married when they were young to go run around with some young girls because whatever reason it may be, he doesn't really give us many specifications. He doesn't give any specification of why people did this, but he's talking about a moral problem that was going on at the time. It might be also linked to the whole subject of marrying foreign women, which was a big theme at the time and was one of the biggest struggles that Ezra and Nehemiah had. But whatever the case may be, he is critical there mostly about, at least the way I understand it, mostly about the treatment of the first wife. So there really is a very, very good point that I heard from her about this, because you have to also see this. I mean, for us, for men, we don't see it from the woman's perspective, so it was very good to hear it from her. But we also have to understand that to go around and condemn people for something the Torah never actually forbids, and it's more of a cultural thing, is wrong. It's a wrong way of talking about this. But on the other hand, we also have to remember that it is the right of the wife to protest this behavior, to say no to such a thing. I think it was very easily done back then because marriages were contracts. It wasn't just, oh, let's go and go to bed and now we're married. This is another thing that I keep on seeing. People talking about sex being marriage, and it's actually incorrect. These were contracts, either written or oral. My previous video, I spoke a lot about contracts. Another thing that I saw, another opinion that I saw, was that they only would write contracts when there was a doubt or a problem or something. People talk about where's the ceremony with Isaac and Rebecca, Yitzhak and Rivka. First of all, the Torah doesn't describe everything, so there could have been a ceremony, but we also have to remember the negotiation. When the servant goes and speaks with the family of Rivka, he negotiates. That's also part of the way it was done. So there might have been an oral contract or a written contract as well. So sex is not considered to be marriage. Sex is a part of it, but it's only a final part. There are usually were things that came before. But in any case, it's very clear that the wife had rights, especially if the wife came from a family that did have money. If she didn't have money, then in many cases the wife was the daughter was married off because they just had to get out of the house. Then negotiations are a little different. Now, it makes it sound like it's as if a woman is a commodity, and we need to understand that back then, when you had manpower was a commodity. And it's not as if people were buying and selling women. God forbid, it's not what they were doing. But what they were doing was negotiating their rights. negotiating the rights that the wife will be protected in the husband's family, because basically marrying someone was a type of adoption. They embraced her into her family. Now she's under the protection of the husband's family. It is the responsibility of the husband's father, the brothers, the uncles, whomever, to protect this woman. It's not as if, oh, now you're a wife, and you have to do everything that I say. Women had rights. It's just presented in the Tanakh with very, very minimal information. And there are also people who married for love. I mean, we have loads and loads of love songs from the ancient world. We have Shira Shirim, which is clearly a love song. Even if it doesn't present an actual love song between a man and a wife, it shows that people did have this idea of love, and people were involved in singing love songs to one another. And someone decided, it seems to be King Solomon, decided to take this theme of love and use it in his Shira Shirim. And what it shows is that a lot of what we think we understand about the ancient world is probably more derived from a misunderstanding, a misconstruing of what was going on. But it's very important to point out that based on what we can find in archaeology and tombs and so on, there really is no way of knowing what was the norm. It's just, when people say norm, they're usually referencing to something that they want it to be the norm because of some kind of religious aspect that they have. And in truth, in Europe, and especially in the Christian world, polygamy and bigamy was something that was looked down upon. It was something that was actually, seems to be, and again, this is based on what I was able to find, seems to have been promoted by Roman women who were very hurt by the behavior of their husbands. And a lot of these Roman women also became Christians at one point. And they promoted the idea of monogamy. Roman culture, when it came to sexuality, was just horrible. It was a very disgusting, very disturbing world. And it was very common for women to be dragged into certain things. I don't even want to name what they were, but anyone who studied Roman culture knows this. And behavior that's just appalling, things that are obviously forbidden according to Torah. And there were loads of women who were very, very offended by this. The Christian ideal developed, and they developed this idea of monogamy in a very, very extreme way. Now, again, this can be a research argument. This is what I was able to see. I read, for example, a book by a man called Schatzman, who is an expert about this. He actually opened up the discussion about the Roman world amongst Hebrew speakers in a very, very good way. I also studied a lot of subjects, a lot of books that have to do with the Roman culture, how Christianity developed. So this is also peer-reviewed. I actually studied this under professors, PhDs in the university. So these are things that I actually know as fact. I've been tested on these things. And it seems to be, according to at least some of the researchers, that Christianity developed this idea of this ideology of monogamy, extreme monogamy, because of more of an influence of women who, and I think rightfully so, complained and struggled against this very, very abhorrent behavior amongst Romans, and especially Roman officials, people high up in the Roman echelon. And it really bothered them, so they promoted this. And at this time, women were still heavily involved in the church before women were kicked out. At one point, it became a man's club, and women were not allowed to do anything anymore. So Europe, with the spread of Christianity, removed itself from the idea of polygamy or bigamy, and obviously removed itself from practices of adultery and so on, at least in theory. And on the other hand, countries which were not in Europe, such as North Africa in the east, and Yemen, south, and the Arabian Peninsula, and so on, it was not considered to be a problem. And this is an interesting contrast, because when you look at Ashkenazi Jews, there's a heavy influence there of the common culture. By around the 10th, 11th century, it became very problematic to marry more than one wife, because the Christians would probably mock Jews or verbally attack them for this behavior. They didn't need too much of a reason to attack Jews if you were a Christian back then. But the fact remains that it became the common culture, which actually, there's a bit of debate how exactly this happened, but it became a decree amongst Ashkenazi Jews that it is forbidden to marry more than one wife. Today, if someone wants to marry more than one wife, he needs to receive special permission and so on. The law in the state of Israel, I think it's an act from 1952, forbade polygamy. However, if a person, I think the law is that if a person shows up from a country where polygamy or bigamy is allowed, he is allowed to stay married to both wives. It was a situation that happened with certain people that came from North Africa or from Yemen, and they were left alone. They weren't forced to divorce one of the wives. However, even the state of Israel, under the influence of Western culture, forbade this. Now, there was a rabbi called Rabbeinu Gershom Me'or HaGolah. He was a rabbi in a very, very specific area in the German territories. And in his area, he decided, he put down a decree that you're not allowed to marry more than one wife. There are multiple theories why it happened. There are even people argue he never actually did it. It's something that someone put to his name and he never actually did it. But going with the classic understanding, he decreed this. The theory is that either there weren't enough women, maybe because of the Christians, maybe he decreed this for a very specific situation he was in, but people who have done research on the subject have noticed that his decree was really only for his region, but it spread. It spread and then it became law. And then even in sometimes in certain countries which were under Muslim control, some people even accepted this. But we also have to remember that it was still, the majority of people still only married one wife and would never in their right mind marry a second wife for whatever reason. It might be written in the ketubah, it might be something that says they couldn't do physically, maybe weren't interested. You know, there can be multiple reasons. But it seems to be that this practice of not marrying a second wife seems to be something that was created through a political reason and so on. However, there might be something in the Dead Sea Scrolls about an interpretation which appears about the law. I think it's either Leviticus 18 or Leviticus 20, where it talks about not marrying sisters. Now there it seems to me, at least to me, that the word achota, isha achota, really means specifically, literally sisters. It's not a prohibition about polygamy. I know people who argue it is. And what's interesting is that it seems to be that in Dead Sea Scrolls they understood the same thing. They understood as long as, actually they understood something more than that. It wasn't just the idea of as long as a wife is alive, a man is not supposed to marry a second wife. They actually had an even more extreme idea that actually if you marry someone, this is obviously a soulmate. Now the idea of a soulmate is a predestination, deterministic idea that I think is foreign to the Tanakh. I think some of the people representing the Dead Sea Scrolls were people who specifically were influenced by something from the outside. I don't think they can find this or prove this in the Tanakh. Predestination, predetermination is actually a Greek idea. It appears mostly in Greek thought, but it seems to be that these people were very, very fixated on the idea that if you marry someone, this is the only person you're allowed to marry in your entire life. This is the person that you were destined to marry, and that's it. Today, by the way, there's a modern version of this known as the bashert, but the difference is that people say, even if you find your bashert, it's a Yiddish term, by the way, if something happens, you can marry someone else, and then that person becomes your bashert. So it's a bit of an adjustment of that thought. But there was a group that probably believed in this idea, but that came from some obscure interpretation that they had of meaning of words in the book of Leviticus. However, the majority of people, no matter where they were from, believe that there's no problem with this. It's just an issue of should you, could you, would you? Really what it was. However, my opinion about this is that you shouldn't. It's a very, very difficult practice. It is very unhealthy. It creates a rivalry that's really pointless. Some men do this for pure reasons. Some men do this for other reasons. The one case that I know of someone who actually did fall in love with another woman, it was done for pure reasons, but it was done the wrong way. It ended up being very, very bad. I mean, he literally had to peel one woman off of the other. They were trying to kill each other. It was very, very bad. This was a case that happened to a sister of a friend of mine. Very, very bad. These things are ill-advised, but it's not that people didn't do it. But there's a reason the Torah keeps on referring to the wives as the tzarot, as the enemies to one another. The only way something like this can be done is if you have the finances to do this, if you have a way of keeping them separate, and if you have a way to keep both of them happy, or if there's more than one, more than two, which is a little nuts. But If you can keep both of them happy, everyone is satisfied, and you make sure they're not enemies, that actually become friends with one another, that's the only way it can happen. And I'm going to openly say good luck with that. It is not an easy thing to do. Everyone has to be very willing for it, and a lot of women feel betrayed when the man goes with another woman, and I think it's very justified. However, it's very important. I said I will speak about adultery, so this is going to be a little bit of a long video. Prager University, which is an interesting university, very pro-Israel, so I obviously like them, and they came out with a video where they spoke about adultery, and there's one very simple problem they did there. They kind of ignored what adultery is in the Torah. They gave the Western understanding of what adultery is. Adultery is a situation where a man lays with a married woman. That man can be married or not married, it's not the point. The point is that the woman he lays with is already married. If the man is married to another woman and he lays with her, he's married to his wife, and he lays with another woman, if that woman is single, meaning not betrothed and not married, then there's no adultery. It's a stupid thing to do. It is not okay by any circumstance, especially if the person has a marriage contract with the woman, with his wife, or even if there's no contract. The fact that you're married means that any act like this, any relationship with another woman, has to be with the consent not only of the other woman but of the wife. However, it is very important to point out that to condemn people of adultery, which is a capital punishment, and this is my warning, I'm actually very upset about this, claiming that someone committed adultery under rules of Torah when it does not fit the rules of Torah, and by saying that, condemning a person basically to death, is forbidden as well. It is a forbidden act. You are not allowed to do that. Period. There's no question about it. If the man is married and he lays with a woman who is not married or not betrothed, it's not adultery, it's just a stupid act. And I think the wife would have all right to complain, divorce him, whatever they come to, whatever conclusion they come to about what to do about it. If a man does that, it's a stupid move. It is a wrong thing to do. It is a betrayal of the trust of the wife. It is a betrayal of what is considered to be normal and reasonable conduct. However, to condemn someone that they commit adultery is forbidden. Period. You do not want to play around with condemning people to death. It's easy because we're not going to execute that person. It's very easy in our world because everything is like, it's really in theory. But if we were living in a time where the rules of Torah were standing, that would be a false accusation. And you know what you do with false witnesses or false accusations? You roll the punishment onto that person who was the false accuser or the false witness. So it's very important to realize that it's not adultery if the other woman is not married or betrothed. However, when it comes to social public behavior, not okay. It's not okay completely. But you have to remember the difference between one thing and the other. Okay? So if a person who's married and he comes into an agreement with another woman and his wife knows about it and he marries her, that's not adultery. It's just not adultery. You can't put that under the category of adultery. I know this is we're living a time where feminism is standing up, and unfortunately feminists are putting themselves together with people that don't really care about women's rights. But in any case, we're living in a time, this is a very difficult subject to talk about. I will probably get dislikes, I might get very nasty comments, but here's the thing. We're talking about a culture of Torah which is not Western culture. And this is why this subject has to be opened up. We have to discuss this thing as well. However, to point this out again, I do not say it's advisable or right to go out and marry another woman. I think it's ill-advised. I think that the majority of women will be very against, though I know there are Facebook pages, groups of women, Facebook pages that actually have women on them which agree to this idea. But it's important to understand that usually when people married, this is another point I forgot to point out, In many cases, when a woman became the second wife, it was because she needed to marry someone. There are situations where women were not married up to a certain age, and they became less desirable. It's very sexist, it's very, as people say, sexist, ageist, and so on, but this is the reality of what they would do. So there were women who were married off at a much older age because and they became a second wife because their standpoint of negotiation was weaker. So this was another reason why women became a second wife. Because in that world, you didn't have governments, you didn't have people protecting you. Police didn't really exist. There was no real laws protecting you. The only thing protecting you was your clan, was your family. It was very limited what governments could do back then. Governments were never involved in people's personal lives. So it's very important to realize that in many cases when someone was married off as a second wife, she could have been an orphan that needed a family, and this was a very good way to protect her. Sometimes, unfortunately, people had to sell members of families. It's not slavery, but it's very close to it. But people would sometimes sell members of family because they had to protect them, and they have to make sure the rest of the family had money. There were many cases of unfortunate situations where people had to marry off their daughters as a second wife. So it's not an ideal world. There's a lot of bad things out there as well. Today, the world has changed. But to go around and say that the Torah forbids this is also incorrect. And finding little bits and pieces. Adam and Eve, there was only Adam and Eve in the garden. Okay, fine, but you can't take a story like that and use it to argue in favor or against something which is allowed or forbidden in Torah. Stories are one thing, the laws are another thing. You have to kind of separate them from one another to some degree, not completely. Sometimes stories do shed light about the law, but you have to specifically find a law that says a man is not allowed to marry a second wife, unless you want to misconstrue that verse in Leviticus, either 18 or 20. I think it's Leviticus 20, which talks about two sisters and say it's about having two wives. I don't think that's really what it is. Majority of people, almost everyone who reads this verse knows it's not what it is. However, there was a group that did this. In any case, I know this is a very loaded subject. I really hope people realize where I'm coming from about this. Yes, I am a man, and I am saying this from a man's perspective, but I do come from a different culture. I might speak English, but my culture is not Western. My culture is Mediterranean. My culture is from the land of Israel. And though we're very westernized, there are a lot of ideas and mentalities which are very different than the Western world. And though the majority of people here in Israel would say, listen, we're not going to practice polygamy, and I think which is, by the way, a healthier thing, we have to realize there is a difference between what was done in the Western world and what was done in the Mediterranean world, and especially in the culture people kept Torah. I hope this has shed some light on the subject. I hope people are not too offended. But being offended is apparently something people enjoy doing today. So, and I'm not trying to make snark remarks, it's just another observation about culture. So again, comments I leave things with the possibility of putting comments. I had someone make a very anti-Semitic comment several times. People called me names, and you know what? It's fine. I mean, it really doesn't bother me that much. But if you're going to make a comment and you really want to understand Torah, it's more important to make a comment to the point instead of playing around and messing around and so on. So I hope no one's been offended by this. There was no intent to offend anyone. I have to be very careful what you say these days. But this is just an open discussion about the subject. For me, I think it should be seen as a theoretical discussion. I don't think this is something that's healthy to do. But we have to remember that there were situations where it was done. There were reasons that people would practice polygamy and bigamy, and I think that we have to just come to the realization and accept the fact that it did exist instead of twisting and turning and misconstruing information. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it sheds light. I hope that people will have a productive discussion about this video. And I hope you come back and discuss things. Don't forget to visit me at HebrewInIsrael.net and also at Hebrew in Israel, the Facebook page. If you have any questions, emails, HebrewInIsrael@gmail.com. And I welcome people's questions and discussions. Kol Tov.